Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us here at Heritage, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. Previous to that, was the Council's Senior Country Director representing American interests in Indonesia and Singapore. He has served as a Senior Professional Republican Staff Member for the Ranking Member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thank you, Jerry. Well, thank you all for coming out to talk about the pivot. I want to make a note here at the outset. I guess in the title of our program, there's a certain amount of skepticism expressed. I don't think you ought to confuse that for a lack of support for increased U.S. commitment to Asia Pacific. At least speaking on behalf of myself, I think Bruce, and we can let our guests speak for themselves. We're all supportive of increased U.S. engagement in the region across the board, including on the military side. I think what has a lot of us worried is that there may just not be enough there for us to do that, and that it's not sufficiently resourced, basically. We're going to get to that and discuss whether indeed there is enough being devoted to it in just a second. I just want to make a couple brief introductions. We've got a great panel. First off, Donald Winter. Secretary Winter is former Secretary of the Navy, serving in the Bush administration 2006 to 2009. Prior to that, he served as Corporate Vice President and President of Northrop Grumman's Mission Systems, and as President and CEO of TRW Systems. He has a master's degree and a doctorate in physics from the University of Michigan. Bud Cole. Bud is a 30-year Navy veteran, professor of history at the National War College in Washington. He focuses there on U.S.-China relations and maritime strategy. He's written quite a few books. One we had him over to talk about not too long after it came out, called The Great Wall at Sea, China's Navy in the 21st Century. Quite a good book on this topic. It's the sort of thing that everybody's talking about. It's nice to have a book where someone's writing about it who actually knows the topic, so I commend it to you. Dr. Cole's PhD is in history from Auburn University. And then we'll turn to Jim Auer. Jim is director of the Center for U.S.-Japan Studies in Cooperation at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Auer is a 20-year Navy veteran, former long-serving special assistant for Japan in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. His doctor, in front of his name, is courtesy of a PhD in International Relations from Fletcher. And Bruce Klingner, our own in-house specialist here on Japan and Korea specifically, has a deep background in intelligence, spent 20 years in DIA and CIA, and we're very fortunate to have him here on an everyday basis to walk us through these issues, and he's going to share a little bit with that with you in just a moment. So with that, let me turn it over to Donald, and he can get us started. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. If it's okay, I'm going to talk from my chair here. Excuse me. And perhaps understandably, I'm going to talk from a perspective, naval perspective, if you will, in the Pacific. And a naval perspective is perhaps very appropriate because our Navy and Marine Corps have been dealing with the Pacific for many years and are likely to have to do so in the future for many years to come. When one looks at a region from a naval perspective, one of the first things we tend to do is to take a look at what's happening in the maritime domain, what's happening at sea. And what we see in the Pacific in particular is a tremendous degree of maritime commerce. Just to give you some sense of the economic import of this, you can take a look at the PRC exports that are running right now about $2 trillion per year, of which a little bit less than 20% comes to the United States. And for those of you who like to think of this in terms of containers, that's about 30 million TEUs per year that are coming across the Pacific. If one takes a look at choke points in the Pacific, Strait of Malacca in particular, one recognizes that you've got roughly 60,000 vessels per year transiting the strait, carrying roughly 1/4 of the world's goods. including about 15 million barrels per day of oil. Some very significant numbers there. And I think all of this points out the great vulnerability, if you will, of the world economy to the status of the seas in that region. Unfortunately, those seas that are transited by that commerce are the scene of multiple conflicts. Conflicts over island ownership, conflicts over the extent of territorial waters, the extent of exclusive economic zones, and this occurs throughout the region, from the Sea of Japan to the East China Sea to the South China Sea. Most of this today is fueled by considerations of oil and gas resources underneath the seabed. And perhaps some of that import is understandable given the fact that two of the nations there, Japan and China, are two of the three top oil importers in the world. Some of these disputes are further exacerbated, if you will, by historical grievances which add to the emotional content of those disputes and make the resolution of those disputes extremely complex. You add to all of that mix consideration of the governments in the region, which run the gamut of everything from democratically elected parliamentary states to totalitarian rule that are, quite frankly, at least for me, often hard to comprehend. I'm not sure I can understand, perhaps we'll hear later on today a reason for understanding, things like the DPRK saber rattling that occurred roughly 6 months ago, or the sinking of the ROK corvette, the Chonan, a few years ago. Add to all of that the buildup of naval power in the regime, in particular the investments that the PRC is making in terms of both quantity and capability of their naval assets, with modern diesel-electric submarines, modern destroyers, the Luyan 2 and 3 type destroyers, and now the new carrier that they're putting out to sea. And all of this is occurring in a region where the U.S. has significant security commitments to countries like Japan and Korea. And I'll leave it to the later speakers to go into more detail there, but what I'd like to focus on is the challenge for our Navy and Marine Corps of protecting U.S. interests in the region, and doing so by way of dissuasion, deterrence, and, if necessary, the ability to engage and defeat adversaries in the region. And all of that requires a very capable presence and the ability to surge when needed. This is a challenge in the Pacific, as I'm sure most of you are very aware of. The Pacific is a huge region. It's roughly 60 million square miles of sea. We often refer to the tyranny of distance in the Pacific. And just to give you some numbers here for reference, you take a look at the normal sea lane between San Diego and Shanghai, it's 5,800 nautical miles. At 20 knots, that takes 12 days to transit. Even if you take a look at our forwardmost state, Hawaii, and take a look at the sea lane between Honolulu and Shanghai, that's 4,600 nautical miles, 9.5 days at 20 knots. For that reason, forward basing, forward positioning of U.S. forces has always been a core element of the U.S. strategy in the Pacific. Most of that obviously occurs in Japan as the result of the post-World War II agreements. We have a carrier and associated surface elements in Yokosuka. We have amphibious ships in Sasebo, and we have the Marines in Okinawa. Now, that latter component, the presence in Okinawa, has been rather contentious of late, particularly with regard to Futenma and the air base that's utilized by the Marines there. Some of this has to do with encroachment considerations, some of this has to do with land value, some of which is cultural in source. We negotiated an agreement with the government of Japan back in 2006. We agreed to move 8,000 Marines to Guam. Not as far back as Hawaii, it's still forward, not as good as Okinawa, but at least U.S. territory. And as part of that also, the objective was to relocate the Futenma Air Base, the activities there, to an underdeveloped area of Okinawa, Camp Schwab. And Japan was going to share the cost of that repositioning activity. Unfortunately, the repositioning of the airbase has been opposed by local elements, and effectively the entirety of the agreement has been held up. The agreement was renegotiated last year. The revised agreement has two interesting components, one of which is we will now move 9,000 Marines from Okinawa, 4,700, I believe, 4,800 around that number, to Guam, and the rest elsewhere, TBD, in the Pacific. And that agreement also decoupled the move of the Marines and the relocation of the airbase. The Guam move alone was estimated a number of years ago to cost roughly $8 billion, of which Japan was going to contribute $3 billion. Total cost of the new arrangement is not clear, in part because not all the moves have been identified, and also in part because the costs go way beyond just providing barracks and facilities for the Marines. It also gets into issues on Guam, such as the basic infrastructure and the ability of that infrastructure, from electricity to potable water to roads and the like, to be able to support the increased military presence there. GAO estimates are north of $10 billion, and we will have to see how much is really going to be required and whether or not this can be budgeted within the 2020 time period that is expected. Why am I going through all of this? Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid that all too often when we talk about Navy budget issues, Department of the Navy budget issues, we get very fixated on the whole shipbuilding issue. Now, shipbuilding is a critical component of the Navy, and we do need to fix the shipbuilding program and get a budget that is appropriate to support the fleet that we need to provide the presence worldwide that is necessary given our commitments. But in and of itself, it is not a solution to our problems. First and foremost, I used to tell members of Congress that I cared less about how many ships I had on the Navy Register, and I cared more about how many ships could put out to sea on any given day. If we take money away from our maintenance accounts to support our shipbuilding accounts, we're going to rob Peter to pay Paul, and we're going to wind up with a less effective fleet. Similarly, if we take money away from our operations budget that's used for training and exercises, critical activities with other nations in the Pacific, such as RIMPAC, we're going to further exacerbate the problem, limiting the readiness of our fleet and hurting our ability to support our nation's commitments. How do we maintain all of those different components and also make the investments in the forward basing that are necessary given the ongoing challenges of being able to operate forward in the Pacific? And the fundamental question is, can the Navy, with the current budget projections, afford all of this? And I will suggest that with the current budget projections, the answer is no. We have a fundamental problem, and that problem is going to have to be resolved. And I look forward to hearing the perspectives of the other members of the panel.
That's good.
Okay. Well, thank you. Honored to be here, and particularly following Secretary Winter. Let me speak for a few minutes about Beijing's naval program. It's a program I would describe as representing moderate naval growth, with one exception that I'll note in a minute. In terms of surface combatants, particularly in terms of amphibious ships and replenishment at sea ships, the growth has been very measured. What has not been measured, however, is the growth in submarines, where Beijing today, if we go back to since 2000, Beijing has built almost 40 conventionally powered submarines, in addition to a new class of nuclear-powered boats. And I think this represents what, at least for the Navy, and perhaps for Beijing overall, is the #1 strategic objective, which is the status of Taiwan. That I believe that China has decided that if, in the event that they decide to use armed force against Taiwan to prevent independence or for some other reason, that if they can sortie 2 or 3 dozen submarines, that would slow or prevent effective U.S. naval intervention for quite a period of time. Hence, they continue to build, especially conventionally powered submarines. The nuclear-powered submarine construction program has been very slow to get off the ground, and in fact, today is in something of a hiatus. Nonetheless, it's clear that in the future, the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy, intends developing a capable nuclear-powered submarine force, both for attack submarines and for fleet ballistic missile submarines. In terms of amphibious warfare ships, I'll just note that they have at least 3 large amphibious ships in the water, remarkably similar to the USS San Antonio class. One might almost think they had copied it, but perish the thought. And are clearly going to build a much larger LHA or LHD size amphibious ship. This will allow them not only to increase amphibious lift, but perhaps equally important, to carry out humanitarian relief operations. I think China was seriously embarrassed after the 2004-2005 tsunami and other deleterious effects from weather in Indonesia and in the Indian Ocean, and they're determined not to let that happen again. And in that lines, they've also built, of course, and operated a hospital ship. The hospital ship is carrying out missions very similar to our own Comfort and Mercy. It has already deployed to the east coast of Africa, the Indian Ocean, the Caribbean, and to the Southwest Pacific. This reflects, I think, one element we can't forget, and that would be a mistake to reduce the U.S.-Chinese relationship to one of just simply the military-to-military relationship. Because clearly, and obviously in East Asia especially, the economic, social, cultural, and political power of China matter a great deal. And it's really one reason, or maybe the major reason, why the nations of that region are so intent on retaining the U.S. naval and military presence in that region, and also indicates why Vietnam particularly is so intent on attracting further Indian involvement east of Malacca as a counterbalance to China. Let me note that from a Chinese perspective, I think that there's, from a U.S.-Chinese perspective in the maritime realm, there's one area of most potential danger, and that is what the Chinese call the 3 Cs, or the Sanhai, the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, and the South China Sea. I believe that in the near term, out to about 2020, that China would like to be able to effect sea control over those 3 Cs, because I believe Beijing thinks that the 3 Cs represent a vital national security interest to China as their littoral waters. As Secretary Winter pointed out, these 3 Cs also border the Republic of South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, not to mention Australia nearby, with all of whom the United States has defense treaties. Additionally, we have special defense relationships with Taiwan, with Singapore, even with Malaysia. We have a closing relationship with Vietnam, as well as other nations of the region. And I think this paints a picture of where we should be paying the most attention from both a diplomatic as well as a maritime perspective in terms of maintaining a balance and being able to maintain our treaty commitments to our friends in that region. Perhaps the most important area that should be of U.S. maritime concern in East Asia, and I include in that South and East Asia, and I'm going to follow something that Secretary Winter said here. It's not counting ships and airplanes, but it has to do with maintaining readiness and numbers of trained personnel, especially. Both the current Chief of Naval Operations and Secretary of Navy have been eloquent in their discussion of the absolute need for forward basing and maintaining readiness if we are to be able to fulfill our national security commitments in South and East Asian waters. And given the current trend of events, that capability is not going to be there. I don't know how soon or in how many years, but it's definitely a matter of certainly deep concern to me personally, and should be a matter of concern to all of us. Thank you.
Jim?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be at Heritage. I've been here a number of times. I couldn't give you the exact dates of any of those except the last one, which I remember precisely, April 16th, 2012. Anybody remember that? I was a panelist. The main speaker was the then governor of Okinawa, governor of Tokyo, Governor Ishihara. The schedule was that Governor Ishihara would speak for 30 minutes. Richard Lawless, former assistant secretary, would speak for 10 minutes, and I would speak for 10 minutes. Governor Ishihara spoke for 57 minutes, and at the 56-minute point said, oh, by the way, we have a plan to buy the Senkaku Islands. And the Heritage had arranged a press conference for exactly 1 hour after, and therefore they said, Lawless, an hour, you can each have 2 minutes. And after he had said we're going to buy the Senkaku Islands, I'm not sure Richard and I minded that we didn't have 10 minutes to speak, but I will always remember that.
We got a little bit of press on that.
Yes, then and since. I graduated from Marquette University 50 years ago this June. Last night, thanks to the Heritage Foundation, I met a classmate of mine, Dick Kaufman, who's here because of Heritage. He saw I was here. Dick and I don't think have seen each other since graduation. And I'm sure Dick and I could tell you that there are some disadvantages to being old. Your body starts to wear out, but there are some advantages. I can't tell you what I had for breakfast this morning, but I remember things that happened long ago. And this pivot or rebalancing is not exactly rocket science and brand new stuff. I was born in July 1941. I don't remember Pearl Harbor so vividly. I remember the end of the war. But following the attack on the United States by Japan, the United States chose to what was then called prioritization and to fight in Europe as our main emphasis before taking on the Japanese full throat in Asia. During the Korea and Vietnam Wars, the U.S. concentrated virtually all of its ready forces in Korea and in Vietnam. In the 1980s, when I was in the Defense Department in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, to reassure the Europeans that we weren't running away from them always, we proclaimed something called the swing strategy. But in fact, the only times we had ever really swung was not to Europe, but to Asia, again, particularly in the time of Korea and Vietnam. We once had 10 aircraft carriers. I don't think we've ever had that before or since off the coast of between North and South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. But the forces that are most capable of swinging, pivoting, or prioritizing are, of course, naval forces, particularly the Navy and the Marine Corps. After September 11th, 2001, we saw the heavy utilization, particularly of the U.S. Army and the U.S. Marine Corps in Iraq and Afghanistan. And of course, more recently, President Obama has announced this pivot or rebalancing in the Pacific. And like Secretary Winter, I certainly agree with the importance of Asia Pacific. And like him, I kind of question how capable we are of really doing this. But let me talk a little bit about Japan. In 1987, my second last year here, before I went off to Vanderbilt and pretended to be an academic, I gave a speech at the U.S. Consulate General in Okinawa. And one of the people who attended that talk was a then professor, later became governor of Okinawa, named Masahide Ota. And Governor Ota, in the Q&A, asked me if the Soviet Union suddenly collapsed, and in 1987, at least I didn't know the Soviet Union was going to collapse 3 years later, and I don't think he did either, but he said, if the Soviet Union collapsed, would the United States then leave Okinawa? And I responded that the U.S. Congress might want to bring U.S. forces back from Asia if the Soviet Union collapsed. But in my opinion, unless North Korea and China similarly collapsed or became weakened at that time, I would think that the government in Tokyo might desire the U.S. to stay put rather than to come back home. Japan's self-defense forces, which are of course a post-war phenomenon, have been basically one theater of operations. But particularly its largest force, its ground self-defense force, which took much of the limited Japanese defense budget, prioritized its forces in Hokkaido, in the northern part of Japan, oriented against a very unlikely Soviet invasion of Hokkaido. Since the end of the Cold War, Japan's defense budget has been declining annually by a fairly small amount, but over 20 years it does add up, despite the fact that in 1997, the US and Japan agreed on guidelines which allowed, post 9/11, Japan to send naval ships, tankers, to the Indian Ocean, its ground self-defense forces to Iraq, not for combat operations, but for support operations, repairing roads, bridges, etc., and Air Self-Defense Force C-130s to the Middle East. These forces, it's important to note, were very helpful to U.S. and other allied efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, but they could not be counted upon to fight. At the time the guidelines were approved and the Japanese forces started going over there, The Economist magazine commented that this is a good first step, but essentially under these US-Japan guidelines, the United States fights and Japan is prepared to hold the United States coat while the United States fights. And those Japanese forces were supposed to come home if the area to which they were deployed ever became dangerous. And finally, in 2009, when the Democratic Party of Japan took power, they did withdraw those Japanese forces from the Indian Ocean and from the Middle East. Futenma, which Secretary Winter spoke about, is a Marine Corps air station in Okinawa. I don't believe it should be a major issue. It's an important issue, but not a major one. The major issue in Japan today, in my opinion, is defense of the Southeast Islands. And I was told if I push a button here, a map will come up. Is that visible? Okay. Unfortunately, in my opinion, the United States does not take a stand on whether the Senkaku Islands in the red circle that you see there are Japanese sovereign territory. I believe as a loyal ally for the last 60 years, Japan has earned the right of the U.S. to recognize the sovereignty over them. However, the U.S. does clearly state that Article 5 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty does apply to the Senkaku Islands because they are territories under the administration of Japan. The United States had to say that they are territories under the administration of Japan because the United States administered the Senkaku Islands from the time of the San Francisco Peace Treaty in 1952 until the reversion of Okinawa in 1973. So we returned administration of them to Japan, and therefore they are covered. But if China attacked the Senkaku Islands, I don't think the United States would resist that Chinese invasion by itself. 99% of the American people, unlike people who are educated by the Heritage Foundation, probably don't know where the Senkaku Islands are. And if they do look at a map, they say, gee, those are a long way from Japan. True. But so it's very, very important if the Japanese want U.S. support in the Senkaku Islands, Japan has to defend them itself. And then if China took action against the Senkaku Islands, I think the United States should and the United States would back up Japan. But because of that orientation of the Japanese self-defense force in Hokkaido and against the Soviet threat, to this point in time, Japanese self-defense force capability in the Southwest Islands has been fairly low. But the times, they are a-changing. The Japanese self-defense forces today have a strategy for defending the Southwest Islands, including the Senkaku Islands, and they have much of the requisite capability. The ground self-defense force, the Japanese Army, is finally being reoriented to the southwest. I think it's necessary to have a combined ground, maritime, and air self-defense capability to defend the Southwest Islands. Okinawa is part of the Southwest Island chain, but in fact, a good bit of the chain is beyond Okinawa towards the direction of Taiwan, again, as you can see in the map, hopefully. This summer, in July and August, there was an exercise off the southern coast of California on a Marine Corps base with active participation of the U.S. Marines, the Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force, and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force. This was a very significant exercise to demonstrate Japan's interest in and capability for protecting its Southwest Islands. And let me close with two questions. First, does Japan need a Marine Corps? I would say the name is not important, but Japan does need and is building an amphibious capability to defend those Southeast Islands. On the 18th of September, the largest Japanese newspaper, the largest newspaper in the world, the Yomiuri Shimbun, reported that a 3,000-man Japanese Ground Self-Defense Force amphibious unit equipped with 6 amphibious auxiliary vehicles, AAVs, will be constituted for the defense of the remote islands in Japanese fiscal year 2014. My second question is the U.S. commitment to back up the Japanese in the Southwest Islands clear to the PLA and to Chinese civilian leaders? I hope so. And again, that's why I support the pivot or the rebalance or whatever you want to call it. For that reason, I believe the relocation of Futenma, those helicopters that are at Futenma, which are part of the U.S. 7th Fleet, and the Ospreys, which are now replacing them, and a realistic U.S. pivot are very, very important. The real question I have is, does the pivot mean an increase in Pacific Command assets, maintenance of the status quo, which my two predecessors have talked about, or does it merely mean that there will be less of a reduction in our Pacific forces than forces in other parts of the world? And I hope that's not. Both as a naval officer and in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, I was fairly involved in the home porting of an aircraft carrier in Yokosuka, which Secretary Winter mentioned. The only aircraft carrier that the United States has ever supported outside of the United States. And when we put the aircraft carrier out there, the U.S. Navy Air Command, AirPAC, said this will never work. That carrier will break down within a year and will have to be dragged back to the United States. The Midway not only didn't break down, but it lasted 10 years beyond its expected capability. And even though it was the oldest carrier in the Navy, it was always number 1 or number 2 in readiness. And its successors were the Independence, Kitty Hawk, and now the only nuclear aircraft carrier we've ever home ported outside of Japan, outside of the United States, the George Washington, is on station there. U.S. credibility in Asia without putting that aircraft carrier out there since the 1970s would be even more suspect than if we're not there. Fortunately, it's so cost effective to have it there that I can't believe that we would pull it back. In fact, to me, it's more important now than it's ever been before. And I think I'm out of time. I can speak a little bit if anyone has an interest in the Q&A to talk about what kind of capability I think Japan needs to have in the Southwest Islands, but I'll stop my remarks here for right now.
Thanks very much. I'm going to talk about 3 topics. First, the Asia pivot itself, and then the impact of the defense budget cuts on the pivot and U.S. interests, and then sort of bore deeper on more specific recommendations for the U.S. and South Korean Navy and Marine Corps. In looking at the pivot, I mean, does anyone really still believe there's an Asia pivot? I mean, to start with, I mean, it is a good strategy for two reasons. One, it acknowledges the very important priority that Asia and the Pacific should have for the United States. And also, it is a comprehensive, integrated strategy using all the instruments of national power, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. The problem is that it's never been sourced, or resourced, or funded to the level that it was. There was always, less than meets the eye, even in the original plan. So, contrary to President Obama's grandiose claim that because of him, the U.S. is back in Asia, I mean, the reality is the U.S. never left Asia. As Jim pointed out, this really is more of a continuation of decades-long U.S. strategy rather than some new rocket scientist. And that actually is good. I mean, it's good that it is consistent with longstanding U.S. strategy and objectives. But President Obama also said that the U.S. will be strengthening our presence in the Asia-Pacific and that budget reductions will not come at the expense of that critical region. But the reality is that, quite simply, there is no pivot in the Asia pivot. I mean, let me repeat that. There is no pivot. It really is, the much vaunted Asia pivot really is more a change in focus than in forces. Because first of all, Secretary Panetta testified, Secretary of Defense Panetta testified that the defense budget would maintain and not increase the current bomber fleet, the carrier fleet, the big deck amphibious fleet, and would only restore Army and Marine Corps levels in the Pacific to the pre-Iraq and Afghanistan deployment levels. And that none of the U.S. forces being withdrawn from Europe or Iraq or Afghanistan are going into the Pacific. So they're not pivoting into the Pacific. So really, it's a case of robbing Peter to not pay Paul. And so there's no plus-up of forces in the Pacific, nor are there any new permanent force deployments. The 4 littoral combat ships going to Singapore will be rotational. The Darwin Initiative, or the 2,500 Marines going to Australia, a good initiative. It reassures our Australia and other Southeast Asian allies and friends. But really, it's just the resurrection of a pre-9/11 program called the Unit Deployment Program. But instead of 3 battalions of Marines rotating to Okinawa, now it'll be sort of 1 each to Okinawa, Guam, and Australia. And senior Australian defense officials will say privately that even by the end of this decade, there won't be more than 1,200 Marines being rotated through Australia and not the promised 2,500. And also, recent events may even raise questions of whether there's a reverse pivot away from Asia. We've seen the situation in Syria, which clearly is overshadowing, at least for the moment, threats in Asia, though I think North Korea and China will be emboldened by what they see as the U.S. confusion and unwillingness to back up its red lines, and even more reluctant allies to engage in military activities. As Secretary Winter pointed out, the revised Guam agreement will be moving Marines earlier than originally planned, and will be moving them further east, not just to Guam, but to Hawaii and even to the west coast of the United States. And also, Secretary of State John Kerry, in his confirmation hearings, testified that he even really questioned the utility of the Asia pivot. He said, "I'm not convinced that the increased military ramp-up is critical yet. I'm not convinced of that."
Critically small.
Right. So anyway, let's now look at some of the impact of the defense budget cuts on the original plan. Now, the pivot and its claimed increase in U.S. military capabilities in the Pacific and our ability to defend our security interests, are only plausible if sufficient resources are provided. But so far, the administration's bold rhetoric has not been matched by any budgetary commitments. And so the current level of security cannot be attained with the cuts that are being considered with the continuation of sequestration. So claims that the U.S. forces in the Pacific will be immune from duties elsewhere, or that the budget cuts or impacted by budget cuts, simply don't hold water. Despite an increase of 100,000 ground troops of Army and Marine Corps during the Afghan and Iraq conflicts, the U.S. still pulled Army and Marine Corps units out of the Pacific. We took a brigade out of South Korea, it never returned, and we took a lot of Marines out of Okinawa. So those Marines are going back, but the brigade from the 2nd Infantry Division didn't go back to Korea. And now the U.S. is eliminating that 100,000 plus up, and we're cutting even below that. So, you know, one would think if we had a major conflict out of that theater, that we're going to be looking at, you know, the very large number of forces in the Pacific and may have to draw from them. And the Pacific Command forces are already being impacted by the budget cuts, the $480 billion before sequestration, plus the additional sequestration mandated cuts. So Deputy Secretary of Defense Ash Carter said that the budget cuts will reduce operations of Pacific-based ships and aircraft by 1/3. 1 in 3 U.S. Air Force combat aircraft worldwide are already grounded, and 2 Navy ships in the Pacific, a submarine and a guided missile destroyer, already can't leave port because of a lack of funding. And the Navy had planned to increase its 285 ship fleet to a minimum fleet of 313, but they won't make that now because of the budget cuts. And for example, the 2011 defense budget funded construction of 57 ships during the next 5 years, but the Asia Pivot budget only allows for 41 ships during the same time period. And since 2001, the Air Force has been given additional missions, while at the same time eliminating 500 aircraft, including 130 transport aircraft to be cut. And when you think of the tyranny of distance that Secretary Winter talked about, and the slow steaming times, and the need for perhaps aircraft transport to get Marines or other units back to the western part of the Pacific, you know, it doesn't make a lot of sense to cut that many transport aircraft. And meanwhile, the aircraft in the inventory are aging. For example, the average age for fighter planes is 22 years. The average age for bombers is 35, and tankers is 47 years. And that, to put that into perspective, the Federal Aviation Administration defines an aircraft as antique if it's more than 30 years old. So we have service members flying antique aircraft in defense of the nation and our interests. Now, the Marine Corps doesn't fare any better, and as a son and father of Marines, I admit a certain affinity for the Corps. And the Marine Corps said that they needed 38 amphibious ships to fulfill the combatant commander requirements, and instead they'll have 28 available. So instead of being given a K-bar, the Marines are being handed a foo-bar. And just to explain a little bit, a K-bar is the combat knife that Marines have, and a foo-bar is military slogan for fouled up beyond all recognition. Now, sort of the third topic, how should the U.S. enhance our maritime security, particularly focused on the Korean Peninsula? So I'm going to highlight some of the recommendations, but not all of the ones that I had in a paper that you can get outside the auditorium. So for the U.S., first we should fully fund U.S. defense requirements. You know, continuing on this path leads to an unacceptable risk to America's armed forces, our allies, and indeed our national interests in the Asia Pacific. 2, strengthen U.S. alliances. Washington can't meet all of these challenges, the security challenges, on our own. So we're going to have to urge our allies, particularly the Republic of Korea and Japan, to augment their defense budgets and increase their security role. And 3, integrate air-sea battle strategy with allies' missions and capabilities. So with the allies being called upon to assume greater security responsibilities, we should ensure that they're suitably integrated into the new strategy. So far, there's more really questions or confusion about the strategy than there are firm answers. 4, increase U.S. naval ship deployments to Korea. I think Washington and Seoul should explore the potential for permanently deploying elements of the U.S. 7th Fleet, such as destroyers or subs, to Korea, or home porting or at least rotating some of the ships, such as the LCS. 5, increase the scope and frequency of combined naval exercises, particularly in the West Sea, and not be deterred by Chinese reactions, as we have been in the past since the sinking of the Cheonan and the shelling of Yongpyong Island. 6, enhance U.S. ROK submarine operations. The U.S. and ROK Navy should conduct joint anti-sub ops and mine warfare training in Korean littoral waters, as well as nearby sea lanes of communication. And finally, for the U.S., redeploy the Apache attack helicopters unit to Korea. They not only carry out ground combat missions, but they can also target the North Korean air cushion special force delivery vehicles. Now, what can the Republic of Korea do? Again, fully fund defense requirements. And what they need to do is focus particularly on improving their C4 ISR capabilities, as well as their enhanced long-range precision strike capabilities. Also, improve missile defenses and integrate them into the comprehensive allied network rather than going it alone as they have so far. Also, augment the ROC Marine Corps capabilities. That there should be expanding the Corps by, as a presidential task force recommended, 4,000 Marines, and also increase the ROC Marine airlift and sea lift capabilities. Right now, the ROC Marines can't get to the fight without relying on U.S. Navy or U.S. Marine Corps transport abilities. So they should have their own organic transport and attack vehicles or ships. Also, purchase CH-46 helicopters for the Tokdo amphibious assault ship. Right now, it's a helicopter carrier that doesn't have any helicopters. They want to develop their own indigenous helicopters. I think a far quicker, far cheaper alternative is buy the CH-46s that have been displaced by the U.S. deployment of the Osprey to Okinawa. Also, increase combined U.S. ROC Marine Corps training. So the U.S. should increase our training in Korea, including the 31st MEU from Okinawa, particularly up in the Northwest Islands and the West Sea. And also include South Korea in the unit deployment program of the Marine Corps, U.S. Marine Corps. And having a more frequent U.S. Marine presence in Korea should offset Seoul's concerns if some of the permanently deployed 28,500 U.S. Forces Koreas move elsewhere for training, such as in the Philippines. So also we need to urge both Korea and Japan to improve their defense cooperation. Although I know it's controversial in today's political environment, both nations, in concert with the U.S., must work towards improving what had been steadily improving military cooperation. So not signing the GSOMIA, the Military Intelligence Sharing Agreement last year, was a huge mistake. It would have provided strong benefit to both Korea and to Japan. And also the U.S. and Japan and South Korea should increase the bilateral and trilateral naval and Marine Corps exercises. So in conclusion, underfunding the defense requirements will lead to a reduced deterrence and diminished influence for the United States in the Pacific. So continued defense cuts will reduce the ability of the United States to deter potential opponents and reassure our friends and allies. And ultimately, the Obama defense, or the Asia pivot defense strategy, is really one of hope. It's a hope that big wars are a thing of the past. It's a hope that our allies will do more. And it's a hope that fewer resources won't risk mission failure or the lives of American men and women in uniform. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Bruce. While you all think of some questions, I know you'll have plenty. I just wanted to start off maybe with a question, especially to Bud and Secretary Winter, because you both referenced not just readiness, but your concern about readiness over your concern for numbers of ships. Is that sort of a fallback position that you're on now? I mean, because of the impact of sequestration and other things going on, I mean, several years ago, before we had all this concern with readiness and sequestration, would you have been unconcerned with the numbers?
No. Always was concerned about the numbers, but the number I'm concerned about more than anything else is the number of ships that are ready and available. And so just building up the Naval Register for the purposes of building it up, keeping ill-maintained ships on the register really doesn't help us. We need to do both. We need to be able to both invest in shipbuilding, but then once we make those ships, we need to make sure that we maintain them. I had the unfortunate responsibility of taking the Kennedy out of service. It's very unfortunate. She should have been able to provide service to the Navy for several additional years. But in the interest of saving a few dollars, certain availabilities of maintenance intervals had been canceled. And the net result was that the ship deteriorated to the point that the deck could not be used. I mean, we could not launch aircraft safely. And so we took the ship out of service. It's not good. It's not good to have a ship that can't be used appropriately, or a ship that you can't count on to be able to make it to its mission deployment when needed.
Great.
I think, first let me note that since I'm a government employee, my views are my own and don't represent those of any agency of the U.S. government. It's the disclaimer I'm required to give. A disclaimer I have been giving that I'm not required to give is that I'm not Chinese. Okay? So when I talk about the Chinese Navy, it's based on my experience as 30 years as a U.S. naval officer. Certainly numbers count. First of all, they have to be the right kind of numbers. I'm not sure how many LCSs it takes to equal the mission capability of an Arleigh Burke-class destroyer, for instance. But let me echo what Secretary Winter said about readiness. The ship has to be ready, and that includes the maintenance periods he referenced, but it also includes personnel numbers. This is really the critical data in my view. When I was on the Navy staff a long time ago, I was responsible for recommending the decommissioning of 4 battleships and all the nuclear-powered cruisers. The reason had nothing to do with operational capability. The reason had to do with personnel numbers. We could not afford to continue to man those ships and keep them operationally ready to deploy, even though we investigated a wide range of possibilities for reduced manning. So certainly numbers count, but readiness counts more.
Thank you. Let me open it up. Questions? Yeah, right here in front.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Broder from Congressional Quarterly. Dr. Cole, I know you mentioned that you said you're not Chinese, but I'd like to ask a Japan-related question to Dr. Auer and to you, Bruce. Bruce, you suggested that you had recommendations of what South Korea, Japan should do. My question is, what is the appetite in Japan to share the burden? And what sort of political obstacles or hurdles does the Prime Minister Shinzo Abe face in trying to, let's say, increase the defense budget, perhaps even alter the Constitution? Thank you.
Do you want to take it? Okay. Particularly frustrating is, in my opinion, is the Korean reluctance to cooperate with Japan at this point in time. I can't recall how many times, but it was numerous, that Korean officials would come to my office in the 1980s and complain about those damn Japanese who are not carrying their weight vis-a-vis the Soviets the way we, the Koreans, are. The Japanese helped us a tremendous amount. And I'm sure Dr. Cole is correct, that the greatest worry right now about the Chinese military buildup is their submarine capability. The Soviet Union during the Cold War had 100 submarines in just its Pacific fleet. And I mean, that was hard for me to sleep over that as an old submarine chaser in the US Navy. But thanks to 100 Japanese Navy P-3Cs and 25 American 7th Fleet P-3Cs, every single Soviet sub coming out of Vladivostok was detected. And they knew it, and we wanted them to know they were detected, so that they knew if the Cold War had ever gone hot that we knew exactly where they were. And deterrence worked perfectly, and the Japanese don't get nearly enough credit. I mean, the American P-3C and the Japanese P-3C could communicate directly with each other, and that capability still exists in the United States and Japan. And I hope we maintain it. We don't lose it, because it again is very important, even though the Chinese fleet's not quite yet as big as the Soviet submarine fleet was. But in 1998, the Prime Minister of Japan and the President of Korea agreed that history is now behind us. The Japanese did some things in the administration of Korea that we didn't like. This comfort women issue is still being dragged up and other things, but that's over. The Japanese have apologized from the level of the emperor to the prime minister down, and the Japan's provided economic assistance to Korea, and we're going to now move beyond history. That was 1998, and the Japanese were very comfortable with that and are trying today to live up to it. But for reasons that maybe Bruce can explain, something has happened internally in Korea and I was in Korea for 3 days at the end of June. And among politicians, government officials, journalists, there's this unbelievable need to show their independence from Japan. And I think the current president of Korea, who would otherwise be a good person, has a particular problem because her father was a respected Korean leader, but during the war was a lieutenant general in the Japanese army. So she has to show her I guess, her independence. And the Koreans today say yes, or at least the ones I spoke with in June, we should have a good relationship with the United States, but we want to have an equal relationship with China. And I said, are you kidding me? You know, the Chinese core interests are Tibet, Taiwan, now beyond that to the South China Sea, to the Senkaku Islands, to the East China Sea, to Okinawa. Korea could be next. And the Koreans had no response. The only Koreans I spoke to who really didn't have this political issue, which I just couldn't fathom, was the Korean Navy. They have recently got P-3s of their own. I think they have 12. And I said, can a Korean P-3 talk to a Japanese P-3 the way an American and Japanese P-3 can speak to each other over a covered circuit? And the admiral who was briefing me said, we'd like to have that capability, but we don't have that. And I think it's for political reasons rather than for operational reasons. And again, Bruce maybe can explain why it is, but to me, it's absolutely against the Korean national interest to do that, but they seem stuck with it and can't figure their way out of it. And the Japanese are extremely frustrated, and people say, oh, Abe is moving to the right. Yeah, he is sort of, except that Japan was so far to the left, Abe hasn't even reached normality yet. I mean, he's trying to achieve a reasonable status for Japan so it can be a good cooperative partner with the United States and would like to be a cooperative partner with Korea. But right now, for some reason, the Koreans don't want to play with this.
Right. There are a lot of aspects in your question. I'll try to cover them in less than 6 hours. First, on Japanese public opinion, I think there's a reluctance to move from the status quo for a number of reasons. I don't think neither Washington or Tokyo over the years has really done a good job of informing or educating the public on the importance of the alliance, the importance of security interests, et cetera. So, and in Japan, the Ministry of Defense doesn't really cast a very long shadow. So national or Diet members don't really see a big incentive to be military experts. So it sort of doesn't really generate a lot of interest in the Japanese public. Also, I think a lot of Japanese would see they've got a pretty good deal. The U.S. is assuming a lot of their role, and it's better to be the logistics arm of the military than the ones that sort of go in and kick down doors and do dangerous things. I had a meeting with a Japanese Diet member. When I was urging Japan to assume a larger role, not only for their own defense but in overseas peacekeeping operations, and was told, Mr. Klingner, it would be a tragedy if a Japanese soldier were to die overseas. Now, as I said, I'm a father of a U.S. Marine, and I just about came out of my chair at that point, saying it's no less a tragedy for an American mother or father. So we had a free and frank exchange of ideas. But so there is that reluctance, but it is being overcome because of Chinese actions and North Korean actions. So as Jim said, it's driving Japan to the right from an extreme starting point on the very far left. So there's a lot of talk about Japanese nationalism, but I think Chinese nationalism is far more dangerous and provocative. Abe wants to move forward on issues that actually have been debated and discussed for decades in Japan: collective self-defense, national security strategy, National Security Council. He's moving forward on those, but it's sort of swimming upstream. I think because of the greater Japanese domestic concern with China and with North Korea, that the environment is more conducive to implementing those changes, and they have the forthcoming National Defense Program guidelines, supposedly by the end of the year, that should push forward on some of these things. It's causing concern amongst the neighbors, in part because of revisionist statements by Prime Minister Abe and others. Those are factually wrong, counterproductive needlessly contentious, and in some cases despicable, some of the comments they make. And it affirms perceptions amongst the neighbors that Japan hasn't suitably atoned for their wartime actions. So, at a time when we're trying to gain greater support within Japan and in the region for a greater Japanese security role, in many ways, Japanese politicians undercut the ability to move forward, on these, what we think would be in all of our allied interests. So, it's going to take, I think, a lot of education amongst the Japanese public as well as amongst the neighbors to try to move forward on things that I think would be a benefit to the U.S., Japan, and Korea.
Hi, Christina Wong with the Washington Times. Thank you all very much for your expertise and perspective. A question for Mr. Klinger. Can you lay out the risks of the pivot being more focused than forces? And Secretary Winter, could you talk about what is the risk of not having ships and personnel ready, and at what point do we lose our readiness to a dangerous degree?
Yeah, as I said, I think the pivot is a good idea. It needs to be sort of implemented. And the danger is if we overhype it, really it's twofold. Both our enemies and our friends can read defense budgets as easily as we can. So if you sort of overhype your ability, and I think what happened is the administration rolled out the pivot with a great deal of hype, and then people pointed out, it's like, excuse me, the emperor doesn't have any clothes. There's no resources there. And then as a counter to that, they then sort of point out, no, we can still do everything. We can run just as high and jump, run fast, jump high, et cetera. And we can still do things because our forces, are fewer, but they're more nimble, they're wiry. Well, it's like having 8 guys on the football field instead of 11. They may be good, but there are only 8 of them. And a ship can only be in so many places at once. So the danger is by overhyping it, our enemies may be emboldened and they realize we can't deliver on our promises. And our friends may be nervous, either nervous because they see it being undercut, or they may be sort of, overly optimistically reassured. Oh, okay, we were afraid you were going to ask us to do more, but since you guys are nimble and wiry and can do everything with no degradation in capabilities, I guess we don't have to do anything. So, I think there is that sort of multifaceted concern.
Before we start on the second one, can I just put a slightly finer point on it, which is to define the word dangerous. To me, dangerous is we get to a point where our commitments to our allies and our treaty obligations are in doubt. At what point do we get where the Chinese look out there and they say, all this reassurance doesn't mean anything. They can't deal with it.
From the standpoint of readiness, what you're concerned about is the ability to respond when needed. We worry about timely response and recognize that one of the beneficial aspects of naval forces is the ability to use those naval forces, the repositioning of those naval forces, to show resolve, to be able to make clear U.S. intent, and to make a statement about the ability of the U.S. to respond with force if and when needed. If you have vessels that are in a shipyard needing repair, the timeline for getting those completed, ready to go to sea, crew worked up and everything is such that they're really not, in any sense, usable for any type of contingency response. And so what it really does is it takes down the numbers so that having ships that are in the middle of their maintenance cycles or their crews in the middle of their training cycles means that those vessels are not available to be utilized to show resolve, to respond when needed, to deploy wherever. It is a tool which is proven to be, I think, one of the best mechanisms of stating the United States' intent. It's part of that spectrum between diplomacy and warfare, of being able to make one's point. And it can be made using naval vessels in a way which is very hard to do with ground forces.
Bud, you've looked at the way the Chinese calculate this. How do you think they see it? What is the point at which they see a potential inability of us to meet our commitments?
Well, first let me start by saying that I believe that Beijing, in every Taiwan Strait crisis from 1950 to 1996, miscalculated what the likely U.S. response would be. And in some of those cases, it had to do with statements by political leaders in this country. In other cases, it had to do with their observation of where U.S. military forces were committed. I could easily foresee a situation where the George Washington is in a complex overhaul in Yokosuka. We have 2 carriers in the Persian Gulf. And a Chinese naval planner would look out and not see a carrier available within X number of weeks. And that would paint a certain tactical picture, but would lead, we have to remember, to possible strategic recommendations to the civilian leadership in Beijing by senior People's Liberation Army leaders. I think the Chinese very carefully track, as any nation would, where possibly opposing naval forces are located. Just as Jim mentioned, that during the Cold War, we kept as accurate a track as we could of Soviet submarines. So I think where the ships are and where they're located is important. Let me just close on this question by noting that a previous Chief of Naval Operations, not Admiral Greener, but one of his predecessors, once said if the full sequestration, that is over the 10-year period, were to take effect, the decades-old U.S. naval pattern of constant deployments would no longer be feasible. And in effect, instead, we'd have to go to sort of a fireman response. In other words, we would theoretically have carrier battle groups or other forces ready to steam, but located in the continental United States. And if an emergency arose, a crisis developed, then those forces would be dispatched from CONUS. And as Secretary Winter noted, and I'm afraid I'm even more pessimistic than he is about the problem of distances, he said 20 knots. From my view, who used to be the aircraft carrier scheduler for Pacific Fleet, I use 14 knots, about 16 miles per hour. So the time required to get, say, from San Diego to Busan or San Diego to Shanghai, or let alone San Diego to Singapore, is that much slower. The time is that much greater.
Thanks. Yes, right here.
Thanks. I'm Jim Hour's classmate.
But he looks younger.
Dick Hoffman. I've heard discussions like this about naval power and where we're going, and frankly, it's very distressing to me. Is it feasible, and my question is it feasible, because the math doesn't add up, the cost of building ships, of manning ships, of maintaining ships continues to increase. Is it feasible to cut the cost of ships? I mean, I can't give you numbers, but I heard from Admiral Greener a month or so ago the cost of a new nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, which was mind-boggling to me. I mean, is it feasible to perhaps not put as much sophisticated stuff on a ship to cut the cost, to make it less, I hate to say this, but to make it less capable in order to keep the cost down? Again, I'm old, and I can remember when we were in Vietnam, the cost of an F-4 was something like $4.5 million. I mean, what's the cost of an F-35 now, just by comparison? That's
Great.
Let's see, we've tried to work that. Obviously, that's a critical aspect in terms of trying to ensure that we have an affordable and capable Navy. One of the reasons for the development of the LCS, the Littoral Combat Ship, was to try to offset, if you will, the average cost of ships when looking at what now is known as DDG 1000, the DDX, the most capable destroyer that we've ever designed. A destroyer which, by the way, is much larger in displacement than any previous destroyer. In fact, way above what might be classified as a destroyer in general sense. You wind up with a vessel which does not have the full capability, which does not have the simultaneous multi-mission capability that an Arleigh Burke does, for example. You get into the question of trade-off between capability and presence. And there are some missions for which, quite frankly, an LCS is perfectly well suited. Using a Arleigh Burke, a DDG, for counter-piracy operations off of Somalia is, quite frankly, a waste. Speed works there, and presence, numbers. Coast of Somalia is about the same dimensions as the east coast of the United States. So having a rather high-speed vessel with an air component associated with it helps a lot. And it doesn't take much firepower to outgun the pirates there. So there are missions. One needs to be concerned about maintaining a reasonable balance. There is no simple answer to this problem. At least we have not uncovered one. But trying to go ahead and develop more cost-effective ships, recognizing that trade-offs have to be made, and recognizing that there is value in numbers to ensure presence, and there's values in making the ships more efficient from a crew perspective, reducing the number of individuals that are required, number of sailors that are required on any given vessel, is also a critical aspect. Another, if you will, experiment with the littoral combat ship. These are all being worked. I worry about us looking for the silver bullet, if you will. We had some very bad experiences, quite frankly, back with the peace dividend that was declared after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And some of the budget cuts, the ways we tried to accommodate those budget cuts. We did some very, quite frankly, dumb things. We tried to substitute commercial products where they really didn't fit in the interest of trying to come up with, quote, more affordable ways of supporting our military forces. Putting investments into affordability is obviously critical, but being realistic about what can and can't be done is also very critical.
Right, a personal thing. Dick, 5 years after we graduated, as a lieutenant, I commanded a minesweeper. And to have a command of a naval ship at age 26 is quite a thrill. The Navy had then, and I assume still has, a lineal list of the seniority of all the commanding officers of active duty Navy ships. Number 1 was the only, at that time, nuclear aircraft carrier, the Enterprise. And number 801 was the USS Peacock that I commanded. There were 802 ships in the Navy. One other minesweeper was commanded by a guy who graduated from the Naval Academy, same time I graduated from Marquette, but I guess my grade point was higher, so I'm on the lineal list. Today we have 270-some ships.
Yeah.
And ship for ship, I mean, even our nuclear aircraft carriers are far more capable because of the aircraft they carry. And so ship for ship, we probably have more total combined capability today than we had back there in 1968 with the 800 ships. But it's simply a reality that 267 ships can't be in as many places as 802 can be. So it's a really hard thing to figure out how to do, as Secretary Winter mentioned.
Let me give one example. When I was on a staff many years ago, the fleet commander went to McDonnell Douglas and said, "How long does it take you to make a Harpoon missile?" This is a anti-ship missile I think we still use. And the answer was 6 weeks. And then the admiral was a very sharp guy. He said, "Well, what if you eliminate all quality assurance checks during the manufacturing process?" And the answer came back 10 days. But that's the kind of risk that we're talking about if we wanted to do things quicker.
I just wonder if I could ask Dr. Cole, you mentioned personnel, which I had not heard before.
Mm-hmm.
Serious issue. If you were able to increase the number of ships, however you did it, do we have the people to man those ships?
I'm afraid I'm not up current on numbers to say. I would intuitively say no, not right now. I mean, getting the allocation for personnel and training them and so forth is a long-term process.
The strategy is, or at least was, to increase the number of ships. At the same time, we're reducing the manning requirements per ship to be able to keep the total end strength, if you will, about even. And that all depends upon our ability to introduce more efficiently manned ships.
The question right here in the back has been waiting a while. Microphone's coming. It's traveling at 5 knots.
Thank you. My name is Matthew Ogden. I work with Executive Intelligence Review. Secretary Winter, you mentioned the increasingly high volume of maritime traffic through the Straits of Malacca. And as you probably know, several proposals for constructing a canal across the Kra Isthmus in Thailand have been proposed for decades. And there was a lot of interest in this from within the United States. I know Dr. Edward Teller was a big proponent of this. At the same time, he was promoting the Strategic Defense Initiative for President Reagan. But also from inside Japan, the Mitsubishi Global Infrastructure Fund was also doing feasibility studies on this. That was in the 80s. Today, this is back on the table. There's interest in Japan, but also in China. I believe this is part of the so-called String of Pearls projects. And also this obviously intersects President Xi Jinping's discussion at the recent SCO meeting of the Eurasian Land Bridge or the New Silk Road. My question is, for our allies in the region, for the United States, but also for China, what would be the possibility of these great projects representing a sort of, I guess the phrase today is constructive engagement, a possibility of collaboration between the powers in the region for the collaborative construction of these development projects for global benefit, trade and commerce?
I'm not sure I can really speculate on how that would work from an international perspective. I will suggest that I think that once the significant upgrade to the Panama Canal is completed here, which we're getting very close on, we're going to see a very significant impact to maritime shipping on a global basis. And oh, by the way, that's going to hit the United States particularly hard, significantly, in terms of the rail land bridge that's been established in the U.S. And the posturing of East Coast ports to be able to deal with post-Panamax vessels. I believe it's going to take that type of an experience, and I'm speaking from a very gut sense here, to precipitate the level of investments that would be needed to build a canal of the type that you're referring to. You know, we have discussions of all these kinds many times. The resources are huge. The time frame is incredible. Can we maintain that type of a joint development relationship over the number of years that it would take to be able to build that type of civil engineering project? I don't know. It would be interesting. But again, it would be a major commitment of financial resources and personnel and civil engineering capabilities.
There's another question over here. Is that it? Yeah, right here.
Thank you. Bingru Wang with Hong Kong Phoenix TV. Secretary Winter, 2 questions. First, last year the Pentagon announced that they are going to shift 60% of the Navy force to Asia Pacific. Do you think it's still feasible to do this by 2020? If yes, does 60% Navy force equals 60% of capability of the US Navy? And secondly, recently the Chinese Navy commander just visited the US. How do you view the current China and US Navy relation? Thank you.
Al, first of all, regarding the shifting from Atlantic to Pacific, this is something we started a number of years ago. In fact, I was involved. I selected San Diego as the home port for the carrier that we shifted from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So some of this is not new. We've been readjusting and trying to fine-tune the deployments as is appropriate. It's not easy to do that. Some of the options are, quite frankly, very difficult, as we've seen here with the move from Okinawa to Guam. It goes both ways. Providing the infrastructure to support, in particular, the infrastructure needed to be able to support a carrier or other major combatants is a non-trivial exercise. I think in particular, given the fiscal constraints that are likely to exist over the foreseeable future, unless something happens here politically, I think it's going to be very difficult to see a major shift of naval assets within the time period that you talked to there. With regard to the engagement between the respective CNOs and between the two navies, I think that sort of engagement is constructive. I think that there has been a, if you will, lack of understanding of what transpires in the PLAN and how the U.S. should read such activities, and apparently vice versa. Although we would assert that we're far more open in terms of not only what we are doing, but why we are doing it. And I think that to the extent that conversations can avoid the potential for miscalculation in the future, they're good. We just have to see how they go and be patient in the process.
I want to get Bud's input, especially on on both of those questions actually, but I think on the Chinese side, that lack of understanding is by design. And I'm not sure all the talk in the world is going to make them any more transparent in that regard. But do you have anything to say, especially on the question of U.S.-China naval relations, but you probably also have a good perspective on the 60-40 split.
Well, I don't think, on the 60-40 split, I think, I don't have anything to add to Secretary Winter's point of view. It's as much a political announcement as it is a force shifting announcement. I do think there's a great deal to be gained with exchanges and increased relationships between our two navies. I do not sign up to the belief that the Chinese are inherently non-transparent. Especially if one is able to read and speak Chinese and is able to gain access to the Chinese military bases and ship, one is able to learn a very great deal about what they do. Anybody who's served and been a commanding officer of a ship, as Jim and I have, know that if you step aboard the fantail of any ship, by the time you walk up to the forecastle, to the front of the ship, you have already gained a pretty good impression of how efficiently that ship is run. I've been aboard about a dozen Chinese combatants over the years, and have learned a great deal, which I then am able to pass on through writing or speaking to other Chinese naval observers in this country. So I do think there's a great deal to be gained by sort of taking the mystery out of regarding each other's forces.
If I could just jump in on the percentage. I mean, there are two ways of changing a percentage. You can add to one side, or you can take away from the other. And so if you're reducing LANTCOM, well, then your percentage in PACOM is increased. And also, if the overall size of your naval fleet is smaller, 60% of a smaller force, it may be less than 50% of the larger force. So I think, again, as Bud was saying, it's a bit of a political announcement. Also, Secretary Panetta had pledged we'd continue to have 11 carriers, which I don't think we will, and 313 ships, which we won't. So, I think it's too easy to focus on that number without realizing the things behind it. On constructive engagement, admittedly, this is more kind of in the context of the U.S.-North Korea, but yeah, a lot of times constructive engagement is kind of a panacea for not doing something else. Sometimes you may have a better understanding of your opponent or the other one, and you realize, wow, he's even worse than I thought, certainly with North Korea. So as Bud said, I think there's not a great deal of misunderstanding about what U.S. intentions are, what Chinese intentions are. So we can have mill-mill relations or, civil society exchanges, et cetera. But, I think there's not as much misunderstanding or if we only knew what they were thinking as perhaps people paint it to be.
No Dennis Rodman to Beijing.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, but if I could just leave on a pessimistic note, is that
Thank you.
we're talking a lot about the perils of sequester, and every member of the Joint Chiefs was up on the Hill 2 years ago warning the same, and we went through it anyway. And if you talk to anyone on the Hill right now, it doesn't sound like there's any prospect of reversing any part of it, whether it's domestic or military. So I hope I hope I'm wrong about that, but it's actually, given the warnings that we're all laying out here, it's a depressing thought. But thank you very much for being here. It's a terrific discussion. Thanks.
Thank you.